So let's deploy our dist folder content. And I mentioned that there are many options for hosting static web apps. AWS S3, Netlify, Firebase hosting. I will go with Firebase since we've been using that in earlier parts of the course already. So you probably have a Firebase project by now, and hence hosting will be easy to set up. You can simply click on hosting in your project, and you could also create a new project for hosting. It doesn't have to be the same one as you have for your Firebase database, just as a side note. But here I will use the same one, and I will click on hosting, and you find instructions here, but in the end, hosting is really simple. If we click on Get Started, we see that we first of all need to install an extra tool. Okay, so let's do that. Let's run this command. On Linux and Mac OS, you might need to add sudo in front of it. On Windows, you don't need to do that. So run this command, and this will then install an extra tool provided by Firebase globally on your machine, and we'll need that tool to then upload our project later. So let's wait for this installation to finish. And once it is finished, we can go to the next step. Now we need to log in by running Firebase login. So let's run this. And this should open up a tab in the browser and allow you to log in if you're not logged in already. Or it prompts you for password and your username, your email address, and you have to log in with those credentials which you used for logging in into your Firebase account before as well. Once that is done, you need to run Firebase init. So copy that command, and now in your project folder, in your entire project folder here, you can run Firebase init. And this will ask you a couple of questions. It asks you which part of Firebase you want to manage with this command line interface we're using at the moment. And we really only want to use hosting here, so select hosting with the arrow keys and press space to mark it, and then enter. Now then you're prompted whether you want to host this into an existing Firebase project or create a new one. As I said, you could create a new one, but I will use an existing one. And then it should list all the projects you have. And I'm simply picking that project with which I worked earlier already. Now we have the interesting part. It asks us what our public directory should be. And that's important because that's the directory which holds the files that will actually be uploaded. So here, that would be the dist folder. So we should enter dist here. Once you entered dist, hit enter, and you're asked whether this should be configured as a single page app and rewrite all URLs to /index.html. Now that can be confusing. Why does this matter? What's this about? For single page applications, you have to be careful when it comes to routing and hosting your app on a server. When a user visits your webpage, let's say it's hosted on a domain like mypage.com, a so-called request is sent to the server. Now let's say that request is not to your main domain, but it's mypage.com/products or anything like that. Now, as I just said, that request hits the server where your static web application, your Vue single page application, is hosted at. Now, this server should actually ignore the path that's part of the request, because if it does not ignore it, then the server will try to find something on the server that matches this request. For example, it looks for a products folder in your hosted files and tries to find an HTML file in such a products folder. And for our app, that would fail, because for our app, the folder structure we deploy is this. We have just one HTML file. In our app, for example, we have a /coaches route, but we have no coaches folder here inside of dist, which is the content that will end up on a server though. That's why we need to tell the server to ignore the path and instead always return the index.html file, which then in turn contains the JavaScript code of our application, where then the view router can take over and handle this path on the client side. So in the browser. And that's really important. The view router does not run on a server, and therefore it can only handle the path which is in the URL if the server ignores it. The development server was already configured to work like this, which is why we didn't have to worry about that before. But web servers, real web servers, typically do not ignore it by default. And that's why Firebase is asking us here if we want to configure this as a single page app. If we choose yes here, which we should, then Firebase will ignore all requests on the server and, as mentioned here, rewrite all URLs to index.html so that always index.html is served. So let's choose yes here. And now it tells us that we already have an index.html file in dist, if it should overwrite this. And here we want to enter no, because we want to keep our file. And now with that, we initialized everything. Now to really deploy this, there's just one change I want to make. In the public folder in index.html, we can edit the index.html file before the project is built. So any changes you want to make to your project, to your HTML code in here, for example, should be made here, not in dist. You should never touch the code which is generated in the dist folder. Instead, edit your input files and rebuild the project if you want to have a different output here. And here, for example, I want to edit the title. It's actually using a placeholder here, in the end pulling in the title from somewhere else. But we can delete this and overwrite this with find a coach, for example, which is my title. And now we could also add a meta tag with a name of description to then also add a description for search engines, like find a coach and grow as a developer. And now with these final tweaks made, I will run npm run build again so that these changes are picked up and reflected in the dist folder, which is now recreated. And now we configured Firebase, we have the final dist folder, now we want to push the code onto Firebase. And that's done if we follow the Firebase instructions by now running Firebase deploy. So now we do that, run Firebase deploy, and this will now take our code and upload it onto Firebase. Now, it shows us a progress here. Let's wait for this to finish. And once it's done, it also gives us the URL where we can visit this app. So I'm going to copy that, open it here. Well, and here is the application which we built before, now running on a real web server. Now, it will be offline when you're viewing this, but you can try it on your own with your own project. And for anything else you want to configure, like a custom domain or anything like that, check out the Firebase console. There, once you deployed your app under hosting, you can see your app, you can add a custom domain, and you can do a bunch of different things here to fine-tune this to your requirements. And that's it for deployment. These are the steps and core concepts you should keep in mind when you want to deploy Vue apps to a real server.